Alright, we're up to the 21st element. The last scene in our story contained an image of a miniature Colosseum to remind you of calcium. Scandium is the 21st element. Scandium reminds me of Scandinavia, which is how it got the name Scandium. When I think of Scandinavia, I think of Vikings. Go back to your mental image of the Colosseum with all the gladiators fighting. Instead of Roman gladiators, make them Vikings from Scandinavia. The Viking combatants look fierce. When you picture these Vikings fighting, imagine their blonde flowing hair and their horned helmets and shields and swords in their arms. They're all slashing away at each other. The Vikings remind you of Scandinavia, which in turn prompts you to recall the 21st element, Scandium. The 22nd element is titanium. Titanium sounds similar to Titanic. Visualize all of the Vikings who've just been fighting each other. After winning their battles, the Vikings go back to their ship, but instead of a classic Viking ship, it's actually the infamous ocean liner, the Titanic. Imagine the very old, large ocean liner, and it's filled with Vikings. When you picture the Titanic swarming with Vikings, you'll remember the 22nd element, titanium. The 23rd element is vanadium. Vanadium sounds like Van Aid. Because the Titanic's so large and there are a lot of wounded Vikings on board, they have an aid van. It's like an ambulance, and it's driving around on the deck of the Titanic, treating all of the wounded. It's an aid van, or a Van Aid. Visualize an ambulance and change it around. Remember, it's a Van Aid, and you'll remember the 23rd element, vanadium. The 24th element is chromium. Chromium sounds like chrome. Imagine the Van Aid is stopping to help some wounded Viking gladiators. The doctor jumps out of the Van Aid and he is made completely of chrome. Chrome's a very shiny, silvery and reflective metal. The doctor is made completely of chrome. Imagine him reflecting everything around him. He's very shiny, and when you look at him, you can actually see yourself in his reflection. The doctor made of chrome will remind you of the 24th element, chromium. The 25th element is manganese. Manganese sounds like mango knees. Imagine the chrome doctor who's giving first aid treatment to each Viking. The initial treatment is a mango to put on their knees. Mango knees. Imagine the doctor giving each Viking a big, ripe mango, and they slice it open and put half a mango on each knee. Mango knees will remind you of the 25th element, manganese. Iron is the 26th element. Picture again the Vikings with mangoes on their knees. The next stage of their strange medical treatment is to use a heavy iron, like a clothes iron you use to iron shirts. The doctor uses it to squash the mango onto their knee and to heat it up. See the doctor with his large clothes iron squashing the mango and heating the fruit to try and heal their knee. When you picture the clothes iron, you will be reminded of the 26th element, iron. The 27th element is cobalt. You can break up the name cobalt into co and bolt. Imagine the clothes iron the doctor is using is very old and broken down. It needs to be held together with two large co-joined bolts, or co-bolts. When you picture these bolts, imagine they're like the bolts you see in pictures of Frankenstein. Frankenstein has bolts stuck into either side of his neck. Picture similar co-bolts stuck into each side of the clothes iron, holding it together. Make them extra large and colourful so they stand out. Cobalts will remind you of the 27th element, cobalt. The 28th element is nickel. A nickel's also a 5-cent coin. Imagine the injured Vikings have been healed, and to prove their fitness, they need to pick up a heavy bag full of nickel coins. They need to pick it up and then drop it overboard. It was a curious medical treatment. The Vikings struggle to pick up the huge heavy bag of nickels and drop it overboard. Imagine the sound of the nickels against each other in the bag and the sound as the bag hits the water. The important thing is to remember the nickels, as they will help you recall the 28th element, nickel. The 29th element is copper. Once the Vikings drop the bag of nickels overboard, they then have to dive underwater to retrieve it. They use long copper pipes as breathing tubes so they can go deep underwater. Picture the bizarre image of each Viking jumping into the water holding onto a long red copper pipe. Imagine them breathing through the pipe, mouth stuck on one end and sucking hard to get enough air to breathe. When you think of this rudimentary diving equipment, you'll also think of the 29th element, copper. The 30th element is zinc. Zinc sounds like sink, maybe a kitchen sink. Visualize one of the Vikings walking around underwater with his copper pipe breathing tube and looking for coins. He kicks his toe on something hard and he sees it's a sink made of zinc. Imagine him walking around and clunk, he hurts his toe and looks down. He sees the huge old sink made of zinc, and that reminds you of zinc, the 30th element. Okay, that's the next 10, so it's time again for a quick revision. Beginning from 21, we have scandium. You remember it by Scandinavia and the Vikings. The Vikings are the gladiators in the mini Colosseum with blonde hair and horned helmets. Vikings remind you of Scandinavia and scandium. After winning their battles, they head back to their ship, the Titanic, reminding you of titanium. Because the Titanic is so large, there is a van aid, or an aid van, driving around on the deck, treating all the wounded Vikings. Van aid equals vanadium. At each stop, a doctor leaps out of the van aid and he's made completely of shiny chrome. That prompts you to remember chromium. The first treatment he gives each Viking is a mango to put on their knees. Mango knees gives you manganese. The Chrome Doctor then uses a heavy clothes iron to squash and heat the mango on their knees. Clothes iron reminds you of iron. The iron itself is old and broken and needs to be held together with two large co-joined bolts. These co-bolts remind you of cobalt. After the treatment, the Vikings lift up a huge bag of nickels and drop it overboard. The bag of nickels reminds you of the 28th element, nickel. The Vikings need to jump overboard with a long copper pipe to use as a breathing tube to dive and retrieve the nickel coins. Copper pipes make you recall copper. One of the Vikings walking underwater stubs his toe on a sink made of zinc. The sink gives you the 30th element, zinc.